Yep, that's probably the most severe issue I've had with this gaming PC, which I built only 2 months ago, which is extra annoying because it's a rather higher end of a motherboard and it decided to just lose 90% of its PCIe lanes to its main port, along with just, Ethernet port just giving up, because why wouldn't it? Anyways, that's a bit beyond the point for now. Hello there and welcome, and this is actually the video which was supposed to start off my YouTube channel. However, firstly, Black Ops 7 open beta happened, which was atrocious, and Battlefield 6 happened, which was amazing, and I'm getting to this only now, even though this video was kind of supposed to come out a month ago. Now, I've been a Mac user for the past 10 years, and the funny part, this is actually my first ever PC. Yes, you heard that right, I've never owned a PC myself. Now, despite never owning a PC myself, and this is a part where the title is a bit clickbaity, I've actually built computers before. I've built a computer for my wife, I have helped countless friends to pick their parts, and even helped some of the friends to actually build the PC itself. Now you probably are thinking, why would someone like me switch? You would probably think that in 10 whole years of Mac experience I would organize everything perfectly. Well, there are 3 main reasons. Now the first reason is quite simple, I needed an upgrade. While my Radeon Pro 5500 XT paired with an Intel Core i7-10700K and 64GB of DDR4 RAM could do what I need for work and what I want for leisure, it started to hiccup here and there during workflow tasks and especially started to hiccup during my main way of leisure, which is gaming. I've given up many games, including one of my main games, that being Rainbow Six Siege, for months due to my custom AMD drivers simply not being up to date, and that would cause all kinds of performance issues. And yes, if you would want to game on an Intel-based Mac, you are pretty much required to use Boot Camp, which allows you to dual boot to macOS and to Windows, and if you use Boot Camp, you are basically required to find custom AMD drivers. Firstly, because the official ones haven't been updated since the dinosaurs era, and secondly, even if those drivers would be up to date, they're not gaming drivers, so you could pretty much forget every single gaming feature that AMD has. Now, secondly, new ARM-based Macs cannot provide me with everything that I want now, that being work and gaming. Majority of my friends who I played with are now on PC, so switching to, let's say, an Xbox wasn't really an option due to many games either not supporting crossplay or just lacking entirely on consoles, like all of the MOBA games, many of the strategic games, and whatever you can think of. Thirdly, my requirements for my main machine have changed. Yeah, that happens. Namely, when I got this iMac, which you see now on your screen, my main tasks for my main machine were video editing and coding and of course schoolwork. And specifically for that, workstation GPU with an A-Core i7 were simply perfect, especially in my favorite operating system. And primarily I would still game on my PlayStation 4, with some games being played on my Mac, like Siege and a bit of League of Legends. However, through time, my gaming was shifting from PlayStation 4 to PC, well, to iMac in my case, and to be honest, in many ways, my iMac has been providing a way better experience than my PlayStation 4. However, it's been providing that better experience until this year, mainly due to drivers barely being updated and system requirements rising significantly. I have to say though, even if new Macs would be able to dual boot just like Intel Macs or would stay on Intel overall, I would most likely still build myself a PC. You see, I consider myself at least somewhat rational human being, and I realize perfectly that buying a Mac does not really matter Intel or M series with gaming in mind is absolute insanity. Intel Macs have workstation GPUs, especially if you're buying a higher than a low-end version, which already is really questionable for gaming at best. Almost no games are optimized for macOS, forcing you to either use Wine or setting up dual boot. Drivers for your workstation Mac GPU are barely updated on Windows, and yes, I say Mac GPUs because these particular workstation GPUs are mainly used on Macs. They have quite a bit more of raw power compared to their RX counterparts, however are not focused on gaming and are designed mostly for things like video editing. And those GPUs are lacking many of the gaming features, forcing you to turn to custom drivers which are updated once a millennia. So thinking that, I wanted a universal machine where I can work, play games and all of that without the hustle of doing any of what's been listed above. So I built myself workstation/gaming PC, specs being Ryzen 9 9950X3D, Radeon 9070XT, 32GB of DDR5 at 6000 MB transfers a second, and 2TB NVMe drive.
AMD in a workstation PC should have got NVIDIA and a 9950 X3D with a 9070 XT wholly unbalanced.
Well, if you'd asked me a year ago about which PC I'd build for myself, I would have said NVIDIA for the GPU without any hesitation. However, with all of the questionable marketing practices, paper launches, all of the driver issues which came with the 50 series, still melting connectors on 5090s after claiming that they fixed it, by the way, it would have cost them literal cents to prevent connectors from melting. I decided to side with AMD as my personal stance against NVIDIA. RX 9070 XT is also significantly cheaper where I live, while providing almost the same performance as a 5070 Ti. While I personally didn't skew the numbers one bit, that's where you start if you want change, and the more people switch to AMD is better for now. Ideal market for gamers is going to come only when AMD versus NVIDIA versus Intel is around the same in GPU market share, but we have a long way to go till that's even remotely possible.
Everybody had their hands out, everything was for the taking. And now it's all over.
Secondly, I simply wanted the 9950 X3D, which is basically the most powerful and universal consumer CPU currently on the market. Plus, it's not like I'm not gonna use all of those 16 cores. Some of my work tasks, including this video editing by the way, which is my hobby, but still are quite CPU heavy. So 16 cores are gonna come in handy. Also, in my mind, pretty much every component in this PC is probably outliving my GPU. And since I'm a free man now who is not bothered by sheer unupgradability of Macs, when the time comes I can simply pull out my GPU and replace it with something more powerful. Thankfully a 1000 watt power supply will let me do that with pretty much no issues. Also a 9070 XT can be overclocked, and according to some benchmarks it can get close to a stock 5080 gaming performance in 1440p, but well, my monitor doesn't really support anything beyond ultrawide 1440p, and I'm not planning on upgrading it anyways. And 9070 XT on its own is more than enough of GPU performance for me, at least for now. Also being, again, a somewhat rational human being who does not have golden bars lying around as decorative elements of my house, I do realize that I do not need a 5090 performance. Also, financially speaking, can we talk about the fact that RTX 5080 provides around 20% more performance on average according to Tech PowerUp, while costing 60% more where I live. I do sincerely believe that 9070 XT is the best price to performance you can get right now, and also for me personally it's kind of my stance against NVIDIA. Again, I'm personally not really changing anything, but again, if you want change, you start with yourself. After using Macs for so many years, I really forgot or never realized how much you can do with your PC just because you want to. I wanted an AIO, and here, it's shining right there. I wanted RGB, and here it is. My PC is a Christmas tree, and I absolutely love it. And the sheer realization that I finally own a fully upgradable piece of computing hardware is something I'm truly happy about.
Stop using RGB and go up.
Growing up is realizing that everyone's taste is different, and if someone wants RGB, then someone should absolutely put some extra money into it if he can afford it, of course. The entire tech talk idea of ooh, price to performance, ooh, RGB equals waste of money is stupid. In fact, there are many stupid things about tech talk, and I'm most likely making a separate video on it. Stop criticizing other people's builds and realize that some people, myself included, build their PCs not only with price to performance in mind, but also with things they just want in mind. And trying to bully someone for it is at the very least immature on its own and honestly funny to watch. Unlike many people trying to switch among operating systems, I'm not going to just assume that something is shit just because I'm not used to something. I have seen a lot of videos of Windows users switching to Mac or Mac users switching to Windows, and a lot of their complaints are just stuff that they're not used to. What many people don't seem to understand is that every operating system has different logic behind it, and not a single switch will be pleasant or seamless. You will have to get used to the new logic and the new stuff with each operating system. However, Windows has a lot of surprises, even without things that I'm simply not used to. So yeah, we're starting with things which annoyed me the most, and one of them is, why does option of allow to turn off this device to save power even exist? Why is it on by default, especially on Ultimate Performance Power Plan? Excuse me? The way I even remembered that this exists is due to my Bluetooth keyboard having a delay when starting to type, which objectively wasn't a something like system breaking kind of issue, but it was so annoying. Of course, after I remembered that option the first time on my main motherboard, of course I switched it off for pretty much every single device that I have in my system. However, with my placeholder motherboard, which will be used to upgrade my wife's PC after my RMA claim is done, I remembered about it again. I noticed that when I connect my controller, sometimes the system loses connection to my external drive, and I know it's fine, it's been fine for the past years, and also it loses access to a bunch of more stuff connected through USB. And what do you think? Of course, for every single USB controller in Device Manager, the option of allow to power off this device to save power was turned on. Like, sure, I understand this option on laptops, when you set your power plans like efficiency or something to save battery life, but I am on a desktop PC. My power plan is set to ultimate performance. I don't care about saving power. I'm not the guy who is just like, yeah, global warming doesn't exist. Yes, it does exist. But when my CPU on its own under full load can pull up to 200 watts, I really don't care that two extra USB ports draw a bit of power. I really don't. And I will never understand why this option is on by default on every single power plan. Of course, I can see the use for this function, like for example on laptops, on handhelds, when they disconnect from power, usually the power mode itself goes to like eco or something like that. And of course, in that case, you would want to disable some stuff to save some battery life. But when you're on a desktop PC, I really don't see how this option is going to be useful to anybody who is using a desktop PC. And as I said, I would have understood perfectly if this option was on by default for everything but on like eco power mode or balance power mode. However, if a person goes into power management settings and deliberately puts ultimate performance, trust me, he does not give a single shit about an extra USB port not turning off and pulling some additional watts of power. He really doesn't care. And you know what? This function would be so great and so like eco-friendly or whatever if it would only shut off devices which are not actively in use and have been inactive for like some time, I don't know, let's say 15 minutes. However, what happened was me speaking in Discord with my friends about some ordering nonsense. I don't even remember. We were establishing our own kingdom on a Discord server or whatever, and I was plugging in my controller through a cable, and what happened was my microphone went out for a second because Windows was trying to shut it off to save power. Again, I'm speaking. I'm actively giving a speech about something, whatever. My microphone is actively transmitting data from itself to my PC and from my PC to Discord. Why is Windows trying to shut it off to save power? I will never understand how they coded this function and why they coded this function the way they did. Anyways, enough of me ranting about this great eco-friendly feature which is useless currently because of the way it works. Let's talk about the next thing. It's setting up Windows itself. Anyways, we have settings. Makes sense, right? So we're gonna set up our system in settings, right? Wrong. We also have control panel, also device manager, an entire separate app for Windows Defender, and an entire separate app for the rules of Windows Firewall. We have registry editor, and there's so many apps in Windows to actually set it up. And don't get me wrong, it's actually cool that in Windows there are so many functions for you to set it up exactly the way you like it, but many of the functions which control panel carries or device manager carries could be in settings menu, and it would be so much more convenient and so much more useful, as well as Windows Defender, by the way. I'll never understand why that's a separate app and not just an option in settings. And here we've come to Windows's bloatware. I mean, sure, all of those have their settings apps, and some of those apps are only for advanced users, like for example registry editor. You absolutely shouldn't go into registry editor unless you're absolutely sure about what you're doing there. However, Windows's bloatware doesn't end here. Copilot, OneDrive, Microsoft Teams, which is all installed by default, and it all starts with your system by default for whatever reason. Dear Microsoft, since my Switch, I do use my Windows machine for work, but it does not mean I need Microsoft Teams, plus an entire 69 pages long list of software you don't need or won't ever use. And all of that software is often running in the background, again, for whatever reason. Promote your software, fine by me, but pre-installing absolutely useless garbage and starting it up together with the system is something I won't be able to comprehend. And yeah, sure, Mac isn't perfect in that sense either. Looking at you, iCloud, if you really want zero bloatware, go with Linux, preferably make your own distro as well to avoid all of the bloat. However, on macOS, the amount of bloatware is significantly less, and it significantly less affects the actual performance of the operating system. From where I stand, macOS is all about working with the hardware it's given, especially since the transition to their M chips, which allows them to even better optimize their operating system under their specific hardware. Linux, on the other hand, can run on a literal potato to the point where its system requirements are electricity, and electricity is also kind of optional if you think about it. Windows, on the other hand, yeah, it's gonna take whatever you give it. I'm running a fairly high-end system, so an extra server or two running in the background may not hurt me too much in terms of CPU and GPU performance. However, I sincerely do not understand how it's supposed to run on which hardware again? A 1 GHz CPU and a 4 GB of RAM? Now, Windows does run on its minimal specs, according to this one video that I found, and apparently it takes a bit over 2 GB of RAM with Edge opened. Now, I'm assuming that Windows installed on that laptop uses paging file excessively. However, as I see it, it would be so much cooler if Windows would actually use 4 GB of RAM max while on desktop with no open programs. Now there's a bit of a mind-blown moment that's for some Linux heads. There are a bunch of tweakers for Windows, and I personally used WinAero Tweaker, which allows you to fix the bloat issue. It allows you to disable telemetry, add all of the bullshit running in the background which you don't actually need, and also it provides you with some extra features like an old school Windows 10 action menu, which is so much better than the Windows 11's one. Why did Microsoft have to change it? There's actually so much stuff that I see that Microsoft changes in their operating system, and my question is why? It worked, people liked it, why would you change it? Also, some f***ups with Windows updates, which came out this year, is spectacular. How do you f*** up an SSD within your operating system? This is honestly fascinating. So we're going to be slowly moving towards pros, which I found for myself, and some pros which I decided were even worth mentioning in this video, and I'm gonna start neither here nor there, which is stability, like the general stability of the operating system. And Windows has always been known as one of the most, if not the most unstable system. Now, I haven't really experienced stability issues on this machine, apart from the ones which were related to the faulty PCIe port on my main motherboard. And I will disregard, of course, my experience with Windows on an iMac, because essentially I was running a system with every single driver being custom, and the hardware itself is so unusual, so that it's kind of hard to blame Windows that it can't run properly on that hardware. Anyways, what experience I will count is with my wife's PC. Yeah, sure, I never daily driven that PC, but you know, when there is an issue, of course, I'm the one who goes to her computer and fixes it. And that computer in particular is a really not powerful build. And in 3 years, there were barely any issues related to Windows itself. However, if, or rather should I say when, issues occur with Windows, more often than not, it's something random. The thing about macOS is instability, which sure exists, but macOS is really stable in day-to-day use. Anyways, when instability occurs in macOS, it's often predictable. For instance, one of the sources of instability I had is Final Cut Pro, which I've used quite a bit in my life, and of course I had plugins for it. And some of those plugins aren't exactly stable, and if you happen to run into an unstable plugin, sometimes it could cause an entire system freeze. However, because this system freeze is caused by this particular badly made plugin, you can isolate that entire freeze to that plugin and either not use it entirely or avoid using it as much as possible. While with Windows, well, in my experience and experience of my friends, many times the issues with Windows are completely random. System will run perfectly fine, and all of a sudden one day it blue screens. Why? Nobody knows exactly. Something did go wrong, however why is not always so clear. Also, for people who claim that they've never had any issues with Windows, firstly, I really don't believe you with my experience and experience of all the people around me, and secondly, even if you are the one person who never had any issues with Windows, that's anecdotal evidence, which basically means that only because you never had any issues does not mean that others also never had any issues, and it does not respond to the general stability of the operating system. From what I've seen from tens of people, my friends, my family, myself, because yes, I had Windows PCs, not PCs, but laptops before, Windows works rather stable and then just breaks, usually for no reason. Now we fully come to pros, and this first pro is something I haven't really thought was that important, and it's the process of switching between gaming and leisure. Because on my iMac I had an operating system separation kind of thing. My workflow was built on macOS and of course revolved fully around macOS, and whenever I wanted to game I would go into system settings, change the startup drive and reboot it to Windows. It all looks fine on paper until you actually use it, especially for quite some time, and you would get what I mean if you run a similar setup. At some point, rebooting becomes such a chore that you start mixing separate environments, with doing some work in the gaming one and some gaming in the working one, which would eventually create a bit of mess on its own. And sure, you could say, yeah, you could just stay more disciplined and never do any work on your gaming environment. However, do I really want to reboot my entire PC to correct one PowerPoint slide? No, I don't want to do that, so I'm going to do it in a gaming environment. And with those little small things, over time it accumulates and it creates quite a bit of a mess when some of the working files which you actually now need on your main working system are not on that system, and now you have to either go through the entirety of the Windows file system to find that file from macOS environment or somehow transmit that file from Windows to macOS. And now, when everything is on one operating system, it became so much easier for me. The only thing that I do is I just organize my work stuff kind of in one place in folders, and then my gaming stuff is basically not organized actually. I mean, it's just Steam, EA app and whatever, and just installed games. And for me, it saves so much time and it feels so much less like a chore to start working again or to actually start relaxing after work that it's probably the biggest pro for me at the moment. Now next up is compatibility. Not a single time have I seen something had a question whether it works under Windows, because in 99% of the cases I know the answer, and the answer is yes. Apart from Mac exclusives like Final Cut Pro for instance, everything works on Windows. No need to really tweak anything, no need to f*** your mind over with compatibility layers. You just install it and it just works, usually. Sure, I've tweaked my system quite a bit, but a regular user, even a somewhat advanced user, probably won't have any compatibility issues. Almost every software, every piece of hardware, every little thing you can think of is developed and supported for the most mainstream system, which is Windows. And there's something freeing about not worrying whether something works under your operating system or doesn't. You pretty much know that it does. Yeah, and that's pretty much the entire pro. You see, there is a limited amount of hardware which won't even work under macOS, and which is more often hardware will work but in limited capacity, because the support software for that hardware, be it a keyboard, a mouse, a microphone, a headset, is also limited by the system because it just cannot be as invasive as it can be on Windows. Now, Windows is not exactly an operating system which would let you do anything with it. However, firstly, you still can do anything to it if you put your mind to it. Yeah, deal with Linux users. Windows can also be tweaked extensively. And secondly, I love that I can allow software to mess with pretty much anything without an extra hassle. Sure, Mac's approach is way safer, there's no debating that. Mac will ask you 3 times before granting an app microphone access. However, I do not need that safeguard. Usually when I want a somewhat invasive software, I want it for a reason. The simplest example I could think of is Bloat, if I remember the name correctly. If I don't, the name is on the screen. Basically, it used to be a utility which would allow you to tweak your CPU under macOS, either reduce its power for battery life on your MacBook, or would let you squeeze every single drop of performance after your CPU, well, given that your cooling allows it. And to even try to install this software, you would need to turn off your Mac completely, go into the recovery tool. In that recovery tool, open terminal and enter the command which disables system integrity protection. Might as well turn off security boot, just in case. And then, and only then, this program might work. Sure, I love that macOS is so hard to mess up, it's practically impossible, but holy shit, let me tweak my CPU for f***ing sake. Sure, the upside is utmost stability and security, but are all of those safeguards really necessary to achieve stability? And in my personal opinion, no. I don't think that amount of safeguards is necessary. However, on the upside, sure, Mac is very user-friendly. Even for a total noob, it's really hard to mess something up on macOS, and that could be an upside on its own, to be fair. And the final pro is not really Windows Pro, it's more of a generally PC Pro, but majority of the people, you build yourself a PC, you use Windows on it, right? So it's kind of relevant in this video as well. Basically, if I needed, I could pull out my GPU right now, just literally right now, shut out my PC, pull out GPU, and replace it with something better, or a new one, or whatever I like. Say, a motherboard failure on a MacBook would cost you 500 euros at the very least. Here I pulled it out, filed an RMA claim, and bought a new placeholder one while I wait. Again, I'm not creating eBays, this motherboard that I'm currently using is going to be used to upgrade my wife's PC, alright? Got it? Alright. As I said before, I feel free. I feel so free that I can self-diagnose a failed component, pull it out, buy a new one, and it won't cost me my kidney. Might not even cost me anything if it's still under warranty. Well, except time, of course. A PC can be everything that you want it to be. You can configure just to your liking. And I absolutely love this about PCs. So what I could possibly say from everything that I've said, so to kind of summarize and draw some kind of conclusion. And again, by no means this is an extensive objective comparison of two operating systems. No, this is just my subjective experience. And generally, the more I use tech, especially different kinds of tech, the more I realize that there is almost no absolute truth in anything. All the operating system debates, Mac versus Windows versus Linux, Android versus iOS, ROG Ally versus Steam Deck, are absolutely pointless. I've come to realize that it really doesn't matter what operating system you use, what hardware you use, and if you've overspent on some not so necessary stuff like I did in my build, simply because I could and I wanted to. It all comes to preference and your tasks. For gaming, there is nothing better than Windows, well, for computers at least. Arguably, macOS is a king for video editing, and Linux is an ultimate server hoster and coding hub. All that matter in tech is that your hardware and your operating system answer to your specific needs and what you like. Think about the next time you want to criticize someone with a 5090 using a Full HD monitor. You don't know what that person wanted, you don't know what he used his 5090 for, you don't know anything, and therefore cannot judge that person for what you think is a waste. In the end of the day, this isn't about Mac versus Windows or anything like that. It's about me finally building my perfect setup, one that lets me work, play and mess with RGB at 2 AM if I want to, and sharing it with you. Thanks for watching and listening to me. Cheers.